Good morning, good morning, good morning. It's Alister Chapman here from Visual Impact in Teddington. And I'm getting thumbs up from the back of the room, which is always a good sign. We've had a few problems in the past, lots of thumbs up coming. So welcome everybody to this session on really it's what's it like to shoot with this camera. So I've shot a few different projects with the Sony Burano now, so I can talk about the actual shooting side of it and what it's actually like to use. Do ask those questions though, because the whole idea of this event is for you, and it's an opportunity for you to ask questions about the camera. And as I don't actually work for Sony, I'm not a Sony employee, I am a freelance cinematographer that works as, or does events and stuff like this as a Sony ambassador. I can give you the honest answers as opposed to having to toe any particular marketing line about what the camera is about. Before I go any further though, so Visual Impact, who are Visual Impact? If you don't know who they are, hopefully you do. So they are a major equipment dealer based in the UK in Teddington on the west side of London. I've had a relationship with Visual Impact that I think goes back now close to 30 years. And 30 years ago, they were much smaller than they are today, but a really good company to work with, great people here, very knowledgeable people here, which is really important. A little bit of news about a recent thing that's happening here is that Visual Impact have acquired the unencumbered assets of Shift 4 Limited. So Shift 4 Limited was a major rental house here. So they have a wide range of very high quality film and TV production equipment coming into stock here, used equipment. So do have a look at the Visual Impact website for the latest updates and offerings of what's going to be on offer there. I was talking earlier, and there's some really nice cameras coming, lenses and things like that. So a really good opportunity to get some great used filmmaking equipment at a good price. And if you are struggling with your finances right now, well, Visual Impact might well be able to help with you. So they have the ability to offer finance on purchases, whether that's new or used. So they can help you to buy those bits of equipment that you want. Do give them a ring. Do talk to them about it. They are nice people. They don't bite. And this is all done in-house so that they can put together a package and a deal that suits you and what you have. So do give them a ring. As well as that, you have a great service department here, so if you have problems with your equipment, and this is actually a really good reason for choosing Visual Impact as a dealer, is they have an in-house service department, so if you ever do get a problem, you can call them up and they'll hopefully be able to help you out, and they can sort out all your servicing needs. Also a big rental department, so if you need to hire a camera, anything like that, grip support equipment, they have that here as well. And they regularly run events like this, which is kind of Visual Impact giving back to you. So when you buy stuff from them, they're not just moving boxes, they will support you afterwards with training and events and things like that. So really good company to work with, great company to deal with. Anyway, that's enough about Visual Impact. So today we are looking at the Burano camera, and just a little bit about Burano. So Burano is part of the Sony Cine Outer line with Venice 2, Venice 1, the original Venice camera, and that sort of all dovetails into the cinema line with the FX9, 6, 3, 30, FR7, and everything else. So I'm getting somebody telling me that the audio is clipping massively. Okay, I can bring my audio levels down a little bit if I do have a little level meter, so I'll bring the levels down a little bit, and hopefully that will help things a little bit. But the levels at this end look okay, and we do have other people monitoring here that they're kind of puzzled by the comment. So let's just see how that goes. I've brought the levels down. From what I can tell, we should be good. So we'll continue. So Burano is part of the whole. Is an evolution of the Venice cinema camera family, and okay, that's better, so that's good. And the Venice 2 is a camera that I love shooting with. You have that 8K sensor, incredible dynamic range, and of course it's been used to shoot an incredible number of things and everything now. So including recent productions like Gran Turismo, Ferrari. I don't know if anyone's seen that recently. A lot of big budget Hollywood productions being shot on Venice. And one of the films that I've been involved with, a very small part, is Tim Burton's new Beetlejuice movie that will be released in September of this year. And we used Venice 2 on that. Harris Zambalakis, director of photography on that film, a long-time film cameraman shooting the System 65 cameras. When Venice 2 came out and he got to try it, he decided that finally here's a video camera or an electronic camera that can actually deliver an image that is good enough to replace 65mm film even. So the last of the A Ghost Story in Paris, Agatha Christie movie, was shot with Venice 2 by Harris, and then Beetlejuice. I've only seen a very small fraction of the film, the bit that I was involved with, which was some in-camera special effects with Venice 2. So I haven't seen the whole film. I'm really looking forward to seeing that movie because it's a mix of very practical effects, puppets, models, and all the old school filmmaking with modern technology such as that 8K sensor. So I think it's going to be really exciting to see how that pans out. So we now have the new camera from Sony, Burano. And Burano, it's kind of a, what is Burano? Where does it sit? And I think this is something people are trying to struggle with, actually, because Burano isn't meant to be a mini Venice. Burano is a different type of camera that does sit somewhere between Venice 2, your digital cinema camera, and the FX9. So you wouldn't use a Burano perhaps as your A camera on a shoot like Beetlejuice. You'd use a Venice 2. And perhaps you wouldn't use a Burano if all you do is shoot television news. It's overkill for that. So it sits somewhere in between. And I think it's going to be very, very popular in the sort of higher end documentary production area, low budget short films and things like that, and sitting between the two. So it does share some of the features of Venice 2. It does also sort of share some of the features of the FX6 and those smaller cameras, as well as having this unique feature now that is the combination of the variable ND filter and image stabilization and autofocus all in a cinema type camera, as well as Sony's amazing Venice color science and the XOCN codec, which is a 16-bit codec. So recently I got asked by Sony to go to Norway to shoot some plates for virtual production. And they needed to be 8K, and there wasn't the budget, and I was shooting on my own, so a Venice 2 wasn't really appropriate. Venice 2 is a heavy camera, it's bulky. I'm going up to Norway in the winter where it's going to be very cold and the conditions are going to be very challenging. It just made sense to go and shoot those background plates with the Burano camera. And what I was after was scenic landscapes of the sort of Arctic wasteland, and also then footage of the Northern Lights to put on the big virtual production screen. And in fact, the shoot turned out to be much more challenging than I was expecting because the weather was really, really bad. And it ended up being a really good test for the Burano camera to see how it would perform in that kind of almost like a documentary style shooting situation where I'm traveling from location to location to location. It's not particularly well planned. Obviously, I had a route that I wanted to take and places I wanted to go to get the shots, but I didn't know what the weather would be like when I got to each of those locations, what my weather window would be. The days were getting longer at that time. When I went, it was in March. So it was all a bit sort of make it up as you go along, a bit like a lot of documentary production is, where you kind of know what you want, but you don't know what you're actually going to get when you get there. And Burano turned out to be the perfect camera for it because of this really bad weather, and in particular, very, very strong winds. So I'm going to show you a little film that I made from the trip. You'll see during the film, it says like day 1, Tromsø, day 2. So I was there for 6 days in total. And one of the goals of it was to capture the Northern Lights. And the Northern Lights you can't predict. Sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not. And the other thing is the weather. So sometimes you'll get good weather, you might have a clear sky, another time you'll have cloud. So what I was trying to do was using the weather forecasts each day to try and figure out where the best chances of having clear skies to see the aurora would be, and then driving around the top of Norway between Tromsø and the very, very north of Norway, a place called Northcap, to try and find those clear cloud-free skies each night. And I did end up doing a lot of driving. So here's the video. Let me cue up the video for you. So this last shot here was quite interesting because it started off and the sun hasn't quite set yet. So this was using the camera's S&Q function to shoot this as a time lapse of the sun, the last bit of the sun setting. And then obviously it's getting darker now, we see more of the stars, and then I was lucky that the aurora came out pretty much straight away after sunset. And I'm really pleased with the way this sort of came out, because you've got that still, even now in the shot, you can still see the last traces of the sun on the left-hand side of the frame and then the aurora on the right. Getting a shot like that is pretty challenging. I mean, I shoot a lot of the Northern Lights, so I kind of know what camera settings work really well. And to shoot this, I was using S&Q motion, one frame every second with a 360-degree shutter. So the exposure is 1 second long. And it makes it very easy to shoot a shot like this. As you perhaps saw in the video, on the sort of the third and fourth days, the weather that I had was really pretty awful, and it was extremely windy. And that made shooting very, very challenging. And also, when I'm shooting this time lapse, there's still a bit of wind blowing. And the in-camera stabilization, the in-body image stabilization, was a real game changer for me on this shoot, because it allowed me to actually shoot when I wouldn't have otherwise, with an unstabilized camera, been able to get a decent shot. And I think this is one of the things that perhaps gets a little bit lost in translation with Burano, is that, yes, perhaps there are some areas where Burano has some limitations. Some of the output options are a little bit more limited, perhaps, than some other cameras in terms of what comes out of the HDMI and SDI. But when you're actually on location doing a shoot like this, those problems are not an issue at all. Yet having that image stabilization, the variable ND filter, and all the other tools in the camera make it very easy to actually get the shots that you want. So Burano is a very good camera for that type of shooting. Now, another thing that was a huge challenge during the shoot was the bright light. So the first day, 2 days, and the last day, we had full, clear, blue sky and incredibly bright sunlight. And if you're trying to shoot with an LCD screen like this in very, very bright sunlight, it's very difficult to actually judge and assess your exposure just looking at the screen. But of course, Burano, you can close the viewfinder loop, and now you have what is in effect a controlled viewing environment here. So what you see, the brightness and the contrast of the screen is correct. And that allows you to shoot even in the very, very brightest of light conditions. And in fact, it was so bright that I couldn't actually see the screen at all. Without the loop, it was very, very difficult to see anything. And even with my phone, or I was using a DJI camera for some other little bits and pieces, an action cam for some sort of behind the scenes stuff, I couldn't see those screens. It was really hard, and I certainly couldn't accurately judge exposure using them, but having the loop that you can just close makes a tremendous difference. And the optical quality of this viewfinder is actually very good. So it really is a better viewfinder than the FX9 has currently, and it's very, very usable. Now, being perfectly honest, I do find that there are some slightly strange ergonomic choices with the camera. Given that we have touch autofocus, so at the moment on the camera, I've got a 70 to 200 GM lens on this. It's one of my preferred lenses, and I can touch to focus, so I can just touch the screen. If I bring the camera up, you'll be able to see what I'm doing. So I can just touch on the background, touch on the foreground, use touch to focus to do pull focuses and things like that. So it's really great to use. But of course, if I'm using the touch to focus function, then I can't really do that when the loop is closed, because I can't touch the screen, so I have to open it. Having said that, there are options for rigging this camera now. There are loops that are straight through loops. So the camera is quite easy to reconfigure. If I just take this loop off the viewfinder screen for a moment, I can reorient the LCD quite easily. I can put it, just give me a second, on here like this, so I can have it facing me if my priority is touchscreen, and I can use it this way. And actually, my battery is just about to die on the Burano camera, so I will need another battery for the Burano camera. So that, hopefully a battery will magically make its way up here. But I can use the screen this way, and there are options from accessory manufacturers now for a straight through viewfinder, so that you can actually directly access the viewfinder screen, either a tip-up one, or there is from Bright Tangerine one where you can put your finger in underneath and use the touch screen while using the same optics, the same magnifier. So I think people that are buying Burano, they're going to have to sort of think about how they're going to configure the camera and what accessories they are going to add to it to make it work the way they want it. But frankly, that's the same with most cameras. It's very unusual to actually just buy a camera and for it to work exactly how you want it to be or be configured in terms of accessories out of the box. I mean, most people are going to add a base plate. You're going to probably add some rods. You're probably going to add a cheese plate on the top. So you're going to be buying accessories for it anyway, and that would be the same whether it's an FX6, a Burano, FX9, even a Venice. The good thing about Burano is it does actually come with this viewfinder loop and magnifier. So you do actually get this included in the package. It's not something that you have to add on. I mean, hopefully somebody's gone to get a battery for me for the camera because I'm going to need to use that in a second. I know I think Nikki's just popped out to try and get that. So, you know, it's part of the thing when you buy a camera is what accessories you're going to have with it. For my own camera, when I'm shooting with the Burano, what do I have? Well, I will have a base plate on the bottom. My favorite is Bright Tangerine, but there are plenty of other options from Vocus, wooden camera, etc. So a base plate. These days, I tend to be using stuff that goes on an ARRI-style dovetail rather than a VCT plate because there's less movement in the plate. Then I'll normally have a top cheese plate on here so I can mount my monitors and accessories on arms and things like that. Very often I'll have a wireless transmitter on there, something like that. And then perhaps the Sony viewfinder mounting system is actually quite reasonable on Burano. It's actually quite stable. It's really solid. It doesn't flop about or move about when you don't want it to. You can hinge and pivot the screen nice and easily. So it is quite easy to work with. But I will probably, I'm just waiting for the Bright Tangerine loop to actually become available, and I'm going to add that to the camera. The other things that really sort of help when you're shooting out in a remote location with a camera like this, though, is that variable ND filter, and then also the in-body stabilization. So I'm just going to show you, actually it's a behind-the-scenes film from the Norway trip where I'll show you some of those features. So let me just cue that up for you. Just give me a moment. Here we go. And let's have a look at that. Hi, I'm Alister Chapman and I'm here in Norway in pursuit of the Northern Lights with a Sony Burano. So the plan is over the next couple of days to drive up the coast, starting in Tromsø, then up to Alta, chasing the weather really, trying to find those clear skies that will give me the best opportunities to shoot the Northern Lights. So fingers crossed, the weather is beautiful to start with. I think there's a bit more cloud forecast for later in the week, but we have a lovely start. It's a little bit cold. I think it's going to get quite windy later, so that's never helpful. But let's see what happens. Let's see what we get. I've been out shooting the Aurora last couple of nights and with Burano, and it's performed really well. Now, we haven't had the brightest of auroras, so I haven't been able to shoot it in real time, but I've been using the camera's S&Q function, shooting 8.6K XOCN RAW, and the footage looks really great. And I'm getting really good results, really pleased with it. As I say, having that 16-bit footage, it's the equivalent of taking still photographs of the Aurora. I used to use stills cameras and take still photographs and then post-produce those to make time-lapse sequences. But with the S&Q function on Burano, shooting 1 frame every second, 360-degree shutter, every frame is in effect a still frame, but it's already a video.
So that makes processing it so much easier. The 8.6K means I've got great resolution. If I downsample that to 4K, I get a lot of noise reduction as part of that downsampling. But I've also got the ability to do noise reduction on the 16-bit footage in post, and having that 16-bit footage makes a tremendous difference. Now, another part of the shoot, as well as the Northern Lights, I'm also shooting just general scenery shots. And the last couple of days, we've had some absolutely gorgeous weather in terms of sunshine. It's been blue sky. It's been wonderful. But it's also been extremely windy. So the one thing that's really helped me on this shoot has been having IBIS, the in-body stabilisation. I've got it assigned to this button here. And the last couple of days, in the real strong high winds, it's allowed me to get rock solid, stable shots where otherwise I wouldn't have been able to have shot decent footage. So that's made a tremendous difference. And it's also really, really bright. Like a lot of viewfinders, when you have really, really bright light like this, because it is super bright out here with all the sun and everything else, trying to see the image on an LCD screen is really difficult. But of course, with this camera, I can flip down the loop, and let's see if I can get this in there and we can have a look. And now you can see the screen. You can actually see what's on the screen. And it's also really, really bright. So being able to use the variable ND filter just to put in as much ND as I want has made shooting with this camera so easy. That combination, variable ND filter, the IBIS in-body stabilization, great autofocus, which this camera has as well. When you're outside and it's -11, -12 and windy, it feels really, really cold, and you can't stay out in it for too long. Your hands get frozen. So being able to use the autofocus to keep things in focus is a tremendous help. It really is. So overall, as a package, Burano is a really great camera, and shooting up here with this camera has been an absolute delight.
So the camera for that shoot, I really do feel was absolutely the best camera that I could have used. And the image quality is amazing. That 8K, 8.6K XOCN is absolutely fabulous to work with. So just a reminder, do ask questions. This isn't just about me waffling on about random stuff. The idea is with these sessions is that you do ask questions so that I can answer them, having worked with the camera many times. So the image stabilization works very well, both with E-mount lenses as well as with PL mount lenses. Now, if you're using a PL mount lens, I'm just going to bring the camera up for a second. If I go into the menu for the camera and I go to the shooting settings and I go down to the image stabilization, okay, let me just do that. If I go into the image stabilization, I can turn the image stabilization on to standard. And now the stabilization will work. And I can either have this set to auto or to manual. Now, if you're using a PL mount lens and the lens doesn't pass the focal length metadata to the camera, you do have to set this manually. So I'm actually going to set it to manual and do this manually as though this is a PL mount lens. It's actually an E-mount lens. So the focal length of the lens currently is 70 millimeters. So you would set the focal length to match the lens that you're using. So 70 millimeters. And if I go now to here, and if I turn the stabilization off for a minute and I wobble the camera, you can see the image wobbling, and as soon as I go to standard, you can see that most of that wobble goes away, and then I can go back to off and then to on. The stabilization really is very, very effective, and it really does make a difference, you know, with a lot of those sorts of shots. But you do need, if you're using a PL mount lens, to set the correct focal length. If you set the wrong focal length, so if I go too long on the focal length, I kind of call this earthquake mode. So I'm going to go to 1,000 millimeters, because what's going to happen now, so the stabilization is based on gyroscopic sensors within the camera. And if the sensor thinks the camera is moving, it stabilizes the shot according to the focal length of the lens. If you put too long a focal length in, it will overstabilize the shot. So the slightest bit of camera movement will actually, did I set it? Yes. Will actually overstabilize. In fact, with this lens, it's not so bad. But if you're using a PL lens, it will overstabilize the shot. So it's very important that you do set the correct focal length for the lens that you're using. What that also means, though, is that if you reduce the focal length, so if I go to here, you'll find that actually, even though I'm shaking the camera, some movement still gets through. And that's actually really quite beneficial. Let's turn it on and off so you can see what I'm doing. So this is on and off. And it's quite beneficial to still have some of that movement coming through when you are actually shooting a handheld shot, because you might want to actually, to allow the shot to look handheld rather than completely stable. So one of the questions that's actually come in is what are the challenges with the HDMI and SDI outputs with Burano? So the challenge is that when you change, if you want to use in particular the SDI output, it's not always available with overlays on it, and it depends on which codec that you're using. So if I'm using the XOCN codec, if I bring the camera menu up again, if I go into the full menu of the camera, I'm currently using the XOCN codec. So let me go to the project settings. And you'll see that I'm using the XOCN codec. And when I'm using the XOCN codec, there are some limitations on my outputs. So if I go to the output settings now, to monitoring, and I go to the output format, you can see that I can choose either SDI or HDMI, and I can't have both. And I'm currently using the HDMI because I'm feeding a little Blackmagic Artem Mini switcher via the HDMI. But I can't have both SDI and HDMI, and there are limitations as to which overlays you can have on which output. If I'm using the XAVC codec, that changes, even I struggle to remember what all the different options are, but with the XAVC codec, again, I can't have both. And if I want LUTs, I have to use the HD output. So there are some restrictions and limitations as to what output you can have with which codec. And that it's frustrating, it's a little bit annoying, but out in the field, it doesn't really make a huge difference, because generally when you're shooting with the camera, you'll have either determined whether you need SDI or whether you need HDMI, and you'll set it up that way depending on the codec that you're working. And I think it's quite unusual to actually switch codecs in the middle of a shoot. You'll probably determine that this project I'm going to shoot with XOCN, or this project I'm going to shoot with XAVC, and then set up your monitoring according to the codec that you're using. To actually switch codec halfway through a shot or a shoot is pretty unusual. So the limitations are there, but they don't in reality they certainly haven't caused me too much of a problem. I think perhaps if you've come from a Sony Venice, Venice 1, Venice 2, where you can have different LUTs on different SDI outputs, you've got a separate monitor out and an HDMI, and you can have one LUT on the monitor out, one LUT on the SDI out, no LUT on the HDMI out. You have tremendous flexibility over what's on all the different outputs. If you come from a Venice 2 to a Burano, you will find it a little bit more limited. In particular, one of the things you can't easily do is have a LUT on one output and no LUT, so you can see the S-Log3 on another output. That is one of the sort of limitations with the current firmware. Some of this might change and improve with future firmware. So from Venice to Burano, that is a big difference. If perhaps you're coming from an FX9 or FX6, it's not so different. So that it's just something to consider, but I haven't found it a problem. But the image quality that you get out of the camera with the 16-bit XOCN is absolutely stunning. Now, I think it's to be perfectly honest now, we are at a point where most of the cameras that are on the market today are producing very, very good images. So the differences that we see now between different cameras are small. There's never going to be a night and day difference. And in fact, part of the point of Sony's cinema line, of which Burano is a part, is that there isn't going to be a huge difference, so that you can use a Burano with a Venice 2 or with an FX6 or with an FX3 within the same production. And if provided you're careful with your post-production and your workflow, the audience will find it very, very hard to tell which camera is which in the shot, in the film. So you can cut from one camera to another, perhaps most of it shot with a Venice 2, but you need to pick up some extra shots with a Burano, or perhaps most of it shot with a Burano and you need to add in some footage from an FX3 that the audience won't realize when there's different shots from different cameras. So the picture quality needs to be very, very close, so you can have that ability to mix and match the different cameras. But at the same time, differences do exist. Starting with the 8K sensor in the Burano camera, shooting with that oversampling from 8K means that you have more color resolution in your image than if you have a 4K sensor. And even if you're only delivering in 4K, that does make a difference to the way the quality of the image looks. It's coming out. So what's the point of buying a Venice 2 if there's not so much difference? The differences are small, they're subtle. You would buy, if you're shooting a movie like Beetlejuice or a big Hollywood production, it's more of a question of why would you not use a Venice 2? Because the budget of the production is going to be such that the cost of the camera is largely irrelevant. If you're spending $100,000, £100,000 a day on actors, locations, sets, and everything else, the cost of the camera for that one day of rental or using the Venice 2 for that one day is largely irrelevant. And you may as well just have the very, very, very best image quality that you can. And of course, with a Venice 2, you have all the additional output options with the SDI and HDMI, the ability to have SDIs with the lookup table or LUT on it, or an ASC CDL on it, and then the other two SDIs with an S-Log3 output to feed the video village, and then you've got the fifth output, the monitor output that you can feed maybe to the AC's monitor or something like that. So Venice gives you that flexibility with all the monitoring paths. It gives you open gate full frame. So you have a 6x5 and 4x3 open gate at full frame, which Burano doesn't have. The Burano sensor is essentially running as a 16:9 or 17:9 sensor. So there are definitely advantages to having Venice, but it's not necessarily always about the image quality. The image quality differences are small. You can even take if you compare the quality of the image from an ARRI now to the high-end Sony cameras, it's extremely difficult to see the differences in dynamic range and things like that. The differences, in the color space and things like that. Now, Sony have this vast color space in their cameras, and that allows you to push and pull it in post-production to create different looks and different styles. And I think this is one of the areas where the Sony cameras are doing particularly well right now, is this vast color space, because you're not tied to a certain look. A lot of stuff shot with the ARRI cameras always tends to look very similar or very the same, and people very often talk about the ARRI look. And some of that comes because of a more limited color space. When we go up to the Sony cameras, the color space on these cameras is huge. And that allows us, let me see if I've got a slide to sort of illustrate this for a second. And that allows you to actually, pull out any color space that you want from within that. So if you want to make the Sony cameras look like an ARRI camera, you can. If you want to make them look like a RED camera, you can. And that's one of their big strengths. But as well as making the camera look like a RED camera or look like an ARRI camera, is you're now free to create your own looks. And what we're seeing with the sort of more high-end productions is cinematographers experimenting with very new looks, perhaps much more vivid colors, much more vibrant, larger color palettes. So it doesn't look like film, it looks like something different, perhaps or arguably something better. getting away from the limitations of film, perhaps. And that's now really allowing cinematographers, filmmakers to explore their own look, their own feel for a film. I think with Beetlejuice, you're going to see something quite stylized and quite colorful. That will look different to other films. Top Gun Maverick, shot with Venice 1, looks very different to a lot of other movies because of the color palette that's used in that film. So, and then workflow obviously becomes an important part of that. So with the XOCN footage that I shoot with the Burano camera, and the same with Venice, I use DaVinci Resolve to do my color grading, and I use a color managed workflow. So I don't apply a LUT. I take it into DaVinci Resolve, go into either ACES color managed or DaVinci color managed, which then means I don't need to use a LUT, and I have the full color range of the camera to play with in my grading, so I can push it and pull it and make it look quite different. In fact, I'm going to show you some short extracts now from a couple of different films to show you how easy it is to get very different looks from Burano, from Venice. So these are Burano films because of that 16-bit XOCN. So the first one that I'm going to show you, let me just cue it up, was one of the films that I was involved with in the sort of with a pre-production Burano, and it's called The Sum of One. I was the DIT and worked on the color pipeline for the production, and it's got a very warm look to it, and a quite warm but saturated look. It was shot with the Cooke SP3 lenses, which kind of have a bit of a warm look anyway, but we graded it to give it that a sort of a warmth to it. So let me just show you a bit of the clip.
Success. It's often elusive, but it's attainable. You just have to start. It starts with you. Success comes from you, not at you.
So I'm not going to show you the whole clip, but as you can see, it's got this very sort of saturated, quite generally warm look to it, and that was a deliberate grading choice for this particular film because it really sort of complemented the Cooke SP3 lenses that we used. It also sort of complemented the light. So this was filmed in South Africa, the sort of exterior light that we had, and I think it looks really nice. But then I worked on a different film, or was involved with that quite on the outsides of that, again shot in South Africa, but for that it's a very different look. So let me show you a bit of that film. Let me just cue it up. The idea being to be able to show different looks.
If we could observe the electron at any one instant, the electron would be found at some particular location.
So this is quite a different look. There's actually a lot more blue and green in it, and then the sort of the reds of the faces have been pulled out quite strongly to create this sort of color contrast in the film. It's quite a different color contrast to the other film. And when you have this big color palette from the camera, it does give you the ability to have this wide range of very different looks quite easily, quite simply. And if you use a color managed workflow rather than using LUTs, you have the ability to tap into everything that the sensor captures. You can get very similar results when you shoot with XOCN. So if you were to shoot with XOCN instead of the 16-bit RAW, you can still sort of get the same overall look. You just lose a little bit of the sort of the textures in the skin tones because the 16-bit XOCN codec gives you some more textural values. And this is one of the things that you do see when you're comparing some of these differences with cameras, is that it's not necessarily about the dynamic range. You know, most of the cameras are on the market today 14, 15, even 16 stops, as we have with Burano dynamic range. We have lots of dynamic range, but it's actually about what happens in the mid-range, that the better the sensor is, the higher the color resolution of the sensor. So when we have an 8K sensor versus a 4K sensor, when we have 16-bit recording versus 10-bit recording, is what happens with very subtle textures like skin tones. They become smoother, they look less processed, less electronic. And it's very difficult to actually describe in the picture because it's about something that's not there, which is that slightly electronic look perhaps, or that processed look, is when you start off with a better negative with higher resolution, higher sampling, you get slightly smoother skin tones, a more natural look to natural textures and natural surfaces. And it just makes the image look that little bit better. It's not night and day, but it is better. And I think as filmmakers and cinematographers, certainly if you're trying to make the very best production that you want, that's really what you want to try and achieve, is as natural a looking image as you want. And that helps it look actually a little bit more film-like. So we very much talk about the film look and the cinematographic look, etc. And a lot of that comes from getting an image that doesn't look processed, that doesn't look electronic, that looks natural. And then if you really want to go for a film look, you can add a bit of grain in it in post-production, which is so easy to do now. And you can get something that really does look very, very film-like. Do keep those questions coming. Another question that has come in, actually, that I missed a little bit earlier, was about can you use the EVF from the Venice camera? And unfortunately, no, you can't. It's a different system. So I'm led to believe that the EVF in Venice is analog and the EVF in this is entirely digital. So they're not compatible, or there's some quite key difference like that, which means that you won't ever be able to use the Venice EVF on the Burano camera, which is a shame. I think we also have to think about cost a little bit, is that EVF for the Venice 2 is something like £6,000 or £7,000, something like that. Whereas for the £25,000 that Burano gets, you're getting a viewfinder with it. I think that the design of this is odd. Let's just say that is why does it have the mirror and why does it sort of go on this way? It's definitely a strange decision, and I don't understand it. But actually, in practical terms, using this viewfinder in the field, it's really actually very usable. And that keeps surprising me, is that on the one hand, I think it's a little odd, but then I go out and I use it and I actually use the loop, and I've got a really nice image in this display that's really clear and easy to see. It's not the perfect viewfinder, but compared to the FX9 and most of the other lower cost cameras that are on the market, it's actually one of the better viewfinders that's on cameras today. And if you look at some of the competition of this camera, perhaps if we take Red as an example, it's an obvious competitor to Burano, they don't even come with viewfinders. So you are getting a viewfinder, and it's usable and it's practical and it works. Of course, you're free to add a third-party one, like maybe a Zacuto Gratical or something like that if you want. But don't knock this too much, because it does actually make quite a good viewfinder that's very usable, if not perhaps a little unusual in some of the choices. I'm just going to pop this back off again. So one of the things, just quickly to show you about the concept behind the camera, is that the camera is designed to be used both for the sort of ENG type productions, news gather or documentary productions and things like that, short films, but also it's conceived that the camera would be used on a larger production with a larger crew. So the Sum of One film that was shot in South Africa had a big crew. And in those situations, you might want to treat the camera a little bit more like you would a Venice. And you might want to have the viewfinder, the LCD screen, mounted on the other side of the camera, on this side of the camera, so that the AC can come along and he can access the viewfinder from this side and change the settings on the camera, while on this side you'll have a third-party monitor. It might be an LCD screen, or it could be a third-party EVF. And the AC, or the assistant, or it was me on the shoot in the Sum of One, can go in, change the camera settings, change the media numbers and things like that without affecting what's happening on the camera operator's side of things. So when we're using the screen on this side, it's anticipated that you'll press the home button and you'll have this display, which gives you a very similar menu to the Venice menu, where we've got frame rate, exposure, or EI and ISO, shutter speed, ND filter, the look and monitoring settings, and your white balance. Very similar layout. And then it's either touch screen or there are buttons around it. Now, something else happens when we bring this display up on this screen. So if I bring the camera up on the live feed again. So at the moment, you'll see on here that we're only really seeing the time code, audio, battery level. The little flashing symbol is for a proxy upload, and that we're in manual focus. If I press the home button again, let me just so you can see what I'm doing. If I press the home button again, so that this menu goes away, and I bring the camera up again, you'll now see a much more cluttered display, where we have everything about the camera. We have the exposure index, the shutter, white balance is displayed, the codec information is displayed, everything is displayed in a very cluttered display. So the idea is that when we're using this home menu, if I press the home button on the LCD again, we go to this much less cluttered output. And you could actually turn off the timecode generator, the audio channels and everything else separately to have a clean display and just have perhaps your markers on it. And even if I bring up the menus, so if I bring up the menus without the home button pressed, the menu will come up on the SDI and HDMI output. But when I press the home button, the menus do not come up on the SDI and HDMI. So that means that you can put that LCD screen on the back side of the camera or on the rear facing backwards, so that the assistant or the operator, first AC or the DIT, can make changes to the camera, go into the menu, while your LCD screen or your third-party viewfinder is on this side, isn't going to be cluttered or have the menu popping up every time whoever's on this side of the camera going into the menu brings up the menu. So it has kind of two ways of working. When the home screen is off, then the menu will come up on the outputs whenever I go into the main menu, and they'll be on the SDI and the HDMI output. So it's quite a different way of working. And then we also, when the home screen is off, have all of the information in the LCD, because it's kind of anticipated that this is one-man band shooting, single operator, where you're the person responsible for everything. So while you're shooting, being able to see this information on the viewfinder and the monitor is very useful. Now, the other thing, of course, is you can't really see it here, but the overlays on the LCD are around the edge of the image. They're not over the top of the image, while at the moment on the SDI and HDMI outputs, it will be over the top of the picture. It's over the top of the visible information area. This is going to be improved with a later firmware update. So I believe for the HDMI outputs in one of the later updates, the information will be around the edge of the picture instead of over it. There is a downside to having it around the edge, and that's simply that you're making the actual image that you're trying to focus off smaller. And it's not quite as sharp when it's reduced in size, so focusing becomes a little bit trickier than when it's full screen. So there's pros and cons to to both of those options. So what else can I tell you about the camera? Coming back to looks and things like that, I'm going to show you part of another film. This was shot by, I think it was shot in Australia. And this is a very different film again. The films I've shown you so far have kind of been almost documentary. Even The Sum of One isn't really let's call it a feature or a short. So this is much more of a drama. And I think it's quite interesting to see different DP, different part of the world, different style, different everything else, and a very different looking film. So let's have a quick look at that.
Why do we always reach for more than we need?
Go. Go. Let's go.
Following us?
No. There's no one coming.
Was he there?
He was there. Fuck, we got it.
Oh,
We got it. It's not a stupid idea. You have to hear it out.
You're some criminal fucking mastermind, though. What?
Please, sit down, please.
Why can't we get just a normal drug dealer?
I need this.
This is our moment in time. We're gonna shine. We're gonna shine.
Oh my God, who is he? How much is it?
Holy shit, I don't know so much, baby! We got it!
We can shine.
So while this film is running, I'll let it run to the end. You can watch the films. They're on the Sony website. A couple of questions have come in. And one of the comments is, in this stage of digital cinema, you can create whatever look you want, but they almost all look the same. Well, that's simply because that's a grading choice from whoever's made the film. You can make these look radically different to this if you want, but because people, there's a kind of almost an element of, if I go too far in a different direction, people aren't going to watch my film because it won't look like this. It will not be the, let's call it the contemporary film look. This film here very much has this contemporary sort of almost teal and orange type film look. And if you were to produce something radically different to this, it wouldn't be well received. So I think there's an element here of people not wanting to do something different because this is perceived as being a film-like look. I think film, if you shot with a certain film stock, it would look a certain way. and there were different film stocks you could choose. You had Kodak, you had Fuji, etc., and they did have different variations, but there were only so many different looks because there were only so many different film stocks. Now, we're not tied to a certain look. We absolutely aren't. However, because of trends and fashion and not wanting to push the boat too far the other way, the look tends to be very similar. I mean, certainly in the Sony cinema line community, as an example, there is a certain set of LUTs from a guy called Joel Famularo, and everybody buys and uses those LUTs because everybody thinks that's the best look. So everything ends up looking the same because it's fashionable, because it's trendy, because that's seen as being desirable. But there really isn't any reason why you can't create something totally, totally different, because you have a color palette that is as large as human vision, as human color palette, so you can make it look how you want it to look. You're not really tied to these looks, but this is what people choose to do. Because they feel that this is how it should look. Another question that's come in is about playback and playing playback. So at the moment, playback of XOCN is really not great because the thumbnails aren't necessarily there in XOCN, and the playback is limited. Whether that will improve, I honestly don't know. I do find it a little tricky with the limited playback controls that there are. On a bigger production, I'll have a DIT or a video village, and we'll record it remotely and we'll play back from there, generally speaking. On smaller productions, it's not ideal. I wish it was better, and it is something I think Sony will try to improve on in the future. They are aware that people think it should be better. But whether it will change on this particular camera, I honestly don't know. I would hope that with the XOCN playback, we will get thumbnails and things like that, and there will be some improvements. But whether the ability to scrub at different speeds will improve or not, I honestly don't know. I hope it does. Will it or won't it? I really don't know. So do keep the questions coming in, because we'll be winding up the session in a little bit. So do keep them coming. So because of new trends, we don't get a new Barry Lyndon. Yes. I mean, it's purely down to the choice of the director and the colorist how something looks now. It really is. I mean, the color palette of these cameras is just vast. It's larger than what most people can see. An interesting thing with, you have these different color gamuts. So we have S gamut, the largest color gamut in these cameras, whether that's Venice 2 or Burano, the larger of the yellow triangles, that pretty much covers the entire visible spectrum. But there's another gamut that's not shown on this diagram, something called Pointer's gamut. And this is a guy that went out with a light meter and a color meter, and he actually measured the colors that exist in the real world and plotted those colors on this very same chart. And what he discovered was there's actually very few colors that are outside Rec 709 in the real world that we actually see. Colors outside of that blue triangle Rec 709 in the real world will generally be things like a fluorescent day glow builder's or construction site jacket or a road cone or something like that. But all of your natural textures tend to exist within Rec 709. They might, pretty much Pointer's gamut is roughly the same size actually as DCI P3. And then you have these even bigger gamuts, which these cameras can capture, but there isn't actually that much in terms of color in those areas. So, the colors don't actually exist in the real world to capture. And what the cameras do capture, we're capturing everything that there is. So you can then take that into post and you can twist it and bend it to make it look how you want it to look. So it's down to you and the filmmaker, the colorist. So that is a creative choice. It's not a camera limitation. In terms of color, we have this ability now with an 8K camera, with an 8K sensor, to capture more color resolution. And that color resolution increase, it allows you to grade and push and pull the colors a little bit more, as the same way that having a 16-bit codec over a 10-bit codec does. So even when you're delivering at lower resolutions, it really does help us to get a better image. And I think it's one of the really important things about this camera. The codec, the XOCN codec that you have, so we have many codecs on the camera. This is the different codecs and scan modes that the camera has. So we can shoot at 8.6K in XOCN or XAVC-H. And actually the XAVC-H codec is surprisingly good. It's an H.265 codec. And compared to the H.264 codecs, you see fewer compression artifacts. So it's a really nice option for recording at 8K if you don't want the XOCN. But I do actually find the XOCN very, very easy to work with in post-production. I do most of my grading in DaVinci Resolve. And one of the nice things about XOCN and the way it's recorded is it's very easy to decode it to different resolutions. So you could shoot at 8.6K, but handle it as a 4K or even a 2K file in Resolve for a very, very fluid workflow. And then when you come to your delivery, you just go into the raw settings of Resolve and tell it to go back to the full resolution. And the file sizes are very manageable because XOCN, being a raw codec, is very efficient because we're not recording RG and B or Y, UV and YCB and CR. We're recording a single 8K image. When you could record conventional component video like XAVC, then you're recording a Y, which is your brightness information, then something called CB and CR. They're two components. Basically, they're the blue without the Y and the red without the Y, and from that you can calculate green. It's all very complicated, but you record 3 images. Each one of those would be 8K for an 8K recording, or 4K for a 4K recording. But with the RAW, you just record that single image, which contains the red, green, and blue sensor information. So it's a third of the size. And this is really one of the key benefits of RAW and a codec like XOCN, which is a RAW codec, is the file size is a third, or the amount of data you're recording is a third. So you can either use a higher bit depth or less compression or a bit of both and still have a very manageable file size. So XOCN, it is big compared to XAVC and 4K in particular, but compared to other codecs, it's very manageable, very, very easy to work with. So I've been asked about the color gamuts of ARRI and RED. The ARRI color gamut, the older ARRI color gamut, I don't actually have a diagram for that, but it tends to favor the sort of blues a little bit more. And that tends to give the ARRI cameras a certain look, and they tend to be graded in a certain way that gives them that certain look. The Sony cameras encompass that ARRI color gamut. So if you want to make it look like a ARRI, you can, just by selecting that part of the color gamut in your grading. And RED, well, their color gamut tends to vary a little bit from camera to camera, depending on the sensor that's in that particular camera. So there is some variability over the color gamuts in the RED cameras, even though then when you go into their post-production pipeline, it should try to equalize it and normalize it. It doesn't take away the fact that the sensors are different with slightly different color filters and things like that. So there's a little bit more sort of variability perhaps in the RED cameras, but they have a big color gamut too. I mean, all the cameras that are on the market today have a very big color gamut. So you do have that freedom to create your own looks and styles. But when you have a 16-bit codec with a huge color gamut, it's very easy to get there. So as there aren't a lot more questions coming in, I will keep talking for a little bit longer, so you get a last chance to ask any more questions about, what's Burano like to shoot with. I will wind the session up in a little bit. The session is being recorded, so it's obviously going on YouTube, so you will be able to watch it again should you want to. And we will try and have more of these events here through Visual Impact in the future. And it would be really useful for us if you could let us know what it is that you'd like to be covered in future events, so we can actually talk about that. I mean, one last thing, actually, a couple of last things before I do close things up. One of the things that I really do like having, we haven't actually got it on this camera, is I do think it's worth buying the extra hand grip. So it's very similar to the FX9 hand grip, gives you a hand grip down here. And from that hand grip, you can go into the menus. You can go into the quick menu in particular to change your settings on the fly. And if you are working solo as a one-man band, that's a really nice thing to have. And it also gives you a zoom rocker. So if you are using any of the Sony power zooms, I know there's not many, there's only really the 28 to 135 that you'd use on this camera. It does allow you to have that control over the zoom lens. So I think it is worth adding to your package when you buy the Burano camera. I don't see a lot of new questions coming in. So I think we'll wind the session up. Oh, hang on. How do I find the power consumption? That's actually a very good question. So out, and in particular out in the cold. So when you're shooting out in the cold, one of the big things that makes a difference is the quality of the battery. And there is a big difference between some of the cheaper, lower cost batteries and the mainstream brands. So my preferred brand myself is PAG. I use the PAG PowerLink batteries. You can link them together, stack them together, so you can increase your capacity by putting two batteries together. And with the PAG batteries, down to about minus 15 degrees, I don't really notice much difference in the capacity of the battery. When you get down to about minus 25 degrees, it does start to fall off. You probably lose about 30% down to about minus 25 degrees. When you go below minus 25 degrees C, you really do start to see some fall off, and the PAGs will lose sort of 50% of their capacity in those sorts of temperatures. As a comparison, I'm not going to name the brand, but I've used a Chinese manufacturer's batteries, V-mount batteries, and at minus 15 degrees, I'd lost 60% of the capacity. So it makes a difference. It's down to the quality of the cells that are in that battery pack as to what happens to the battery pack in the very cold weather. On the smaller cameras, on the FX3, A7S3, etc., with the Sony batteries, I see similar performance to the PAG batteries in that down to about minus 15, you might lose 20 or 30%. Minus 15 to minus 25, you might lose 40%. Go below minus 25, you might lose 50%. Some of the Chinese batteries below minus 10 or 15, they've basically just stopped working altogether. And I'll give you 2 or 3 minutes, you put it in the camera and the camera turns on and then sort of shuts off immediately. So the quality of the battery makes an enormous difference to your cold weather performance. So if you're going to shoot, if you know you're shooting in the cold, try to stick with the better brands. That would be sort of like PAG, IDX, Hawkwoods, people like that. Or test the batteries before you go. You can always put them in the deep freeze and try and see what happens when you freeze them down. Your average home deep freeze is about minus 18. The Burano camera uses about 35 watts when you're using the XAVC codecs. So it's not actually a lot more power hungry than the FX9 when you're using the XAVC codec. So if you are somewhere where you really need a lot of runtime, that's really important to you, consider using XAVC-H or XAVC-I. Because when you engage the XOCN codec and you go into the XOCN shooting modes, the XOCN encoder takes quite a lot of extra power, and the power consumption goes up to about 45 watts with the XOCN codec. So you'll need more batteries. Basically, you're going to get about 1/3 less out of the same battery when you're shooting with XOCN than when you're shooting with XAVC. And that's actually one of the reasons why a lot of people have sort of said, well, why don't we have XOCN in an A7S3 or an FX3? And the codec that's used in this camera, or the version of the codec that's in this camera, consumes about 10 watts, which is more than an A7S3 uses anyway. And it would probably result in a camera that overheats and would be very difficult to power manage in that small body. The Burano here, when we have the XOCN codec in, you'll notice the fan runs a little bit more. You can feel that the camera gets a little bit warmer. So that extra power consumption is something that does need to be considered when you're using a much higher quality codec like XOCN. And when I spoke to the engineers, the design engineers behind Burano, they were saying that one of their big engineering challenges with this camera was getting the XOCN codec power consumption down to a reasonable level for a camera of this size. So if you're using a 100 watt-hour battery in normal temperatures, you're going to get close to, or maybe just a little bit over 2 hours from a 100 watt-hour battery with XOCN. With XAVC, that will be 2.5 to 2 3/4 hours. In sort of -20, something like that, with a good battery like a PAG, that drops from being around 2 hours to maybe being 1 hour and 45 minutes. It's not a huge difference. For most of the Aurora shooting that I was doing with the camera, I had 2 of the 90 watt-hour PAGs stacked together, and I was getting typically around 4 hours of runtime and shooting time off those 2 batteries, which is actually pretty good and quite respectable. Venice 2, by comparison, is about 60 watts, depending on how it's configured. So the same 100 watt-hour battery on a Venice 2 is only going to last you about 1 hour and 15 minutes, where it's going to last about close to 2 hours, give or take a little bit, on a Burano. And if you're traveling a lot, in particular, with the limitations on how many batteries you can fly with and things like that, it's a big consideration. When I went up to Burano, it meant I could have the camera body, a couple of lenses, and I think I took 3 of the PAG batteries with me in my carry-on bag without a major drama. With a Venice, bigger camera body, heavier camera body, I would have needed at least 4 batteries, if not 5. It becomes much more challenging. I probably would have had to have actually put the Venice camera in the hold as a checked item in order to be able to take sufficient batteries for the shoot. So these are, this is where, in that particular type of application, Burano works out better than a Venice 2. If I was doing a bigger production with a studio shooter, or there were more people that could help share those batteries, then perhaps you take the Venice 2 with a bigger crew. And I think this is, what we have to consider is what are you shooting? What's the type of thing that you're going to do with the camera, and make your just choice as to what camera to take based on that. And I could use a Burano, but I might actually still use an FX3, or perhaps I really like the Sony A1 for some other shoots where I need to be indiscreet, super portable, and things like that. So there's a place for all of these different cameras. It's just figuring out which one fits your needs and your requirements. With that, I think I will wrap the session up. I hope you found it useful in some way, shape, or form. Thank you for joining the stream. Thank you for listening. Last chance for questions very quickly before I do close it down. I know there's about a 10-15 second delay actually between when I talk and when you hear me. So I'll just wait a moment to see if there's any last minute questions. As I say, visual impact. We've got a question come in. In your opinion, would you say this is a good choice for shooting natural history projects, fast-moving animals, heat extremes, etc.? Again, it depends on the exact subject. Burano is going to be I do think Burano is probably, for a lot of natural history projects, a good choice. You have relatively low power consumption, especially compared to a Venice, a lot of the red cameras. One of the great things about Burano is how quickly it turns on, in fact. So if I turn the camera off, you might see a glitch in the picture when I do this because the mixer doesn't like it. So the camera is now off, and I'm going to turn it on. And if you watch the LCD, watch how quickly it comes on. So here we go, on, and the camera is on, and you can start shooting. If you're shooting natural history and waiting for something unexpected, one of the issues potentially is with a camera that takes a long time to start up, you might have to leave the camera powered up and running for a long time. I mean, some of the red cameras, they can take 15, 20 seconds, perhaps even longer to start. And if something unexpected or perhaps unscripted is going to happen, and you've got to wait 20 or 30 seconds for your camera to boot, that means you're going to have to leave it switched on. So that means you need more batteries. That means you need more power, more charging overnight, etc. Because Burano starts so quickly, it does give you the reassurance, actually, you know what, I can turn this off. And because within it's about 2.5 seconds of turning it on, it's up and running and I can record. That's a big saver, actually, for natural history. You have cache record in it, up to 30 seconds, depending on the codec that you're using. So if the camera is on, you have that 30-second pre-roll, which is really great for capturing unexpected things, as can happen with natural history. I shoot thunderstorms and things like that, and that cache record function allows me to point the camera in the direction of the thunderstorm, wait for the lightning to strike, and then press the record button afterwards. And that then means that I'm not taking back hours of thunderstorm footage and trying to find this one lightning shot that might have occurred in a half-hour-long clip. Instead, my lightning shots are right at the beginning of every clip. So you've got cache record. You've got the ability to shoot using S&Q function. You can go up to 120 frames per second. For a lot of wildlife shots, the fact that the 120 frames per second does crop in means that you're going to have effectively a longer focal length or a tighter shot, and that's very often beneficial for natural history, allows you to get closer and tighter. The fact that you can use autofocus lenses on this camera, and that's not something to be knocked, allows you to track animals. So one of the things that will come in a firmware update is animal recognition for the autofocus. And that makes it much easier to track fast-moving animals when you're using a Sony E-mount autofocus lens. And of course, we go up to 600 millimeters on those lenses now. The 70 to, this is the 70 to 200, but the 200, lens right, the 100 to 600 is a very, very nice lens, and it's relatively low cost for a 600mm lens. So for wildlife, I do think it's a good camera. It does have a bit more rolling shutter than a Venice. We know about this, but actually in most shots, you're not going to see that as a problem if you've shot properly. And if you're shooting wildlife and you focused on the animal that's running, large sensor, shallow depth of field, long lens, the background is going to be very blurred and out of focus. So as you're tracking that animal, you're not going to notice the rolling shutter that's there in the background. So generally speaking, and there have been a couple of wildlife films shot with Burano, tracking animals and things like that. And they were actually released before, right at the launch of the camera, the wildlife films. And there's also the Wingman film, there's tracking aeroplanes, and there's also shots where the guy does the wingsuit and the wingsuit jumping. And nobody noticed rolling shutter in those. It's there, it exists, nobody tried to hide it, but because generally with a large sensor camera, shallow depth of field, long lens, etc., your background is generally so out of focus that you won't notice the rolling shutter. And if you're tracking an object that's mostly filling the screen and you're following it and tracking it, you won't notice the rolling shutter. So I think the whole rolling shutter situation has been over-exaggerated. It's there. Can't say it's not. If you shoot in the 6K scan mode, it's much reduced. And I think a lot of wildlife will choose the 6K mode because that allows you to go up to 60 frames per second. And your file sizes are smaller, so you have 6K XOCN instead of 8K, so the file size is halved. In fact, when you use the 6K mode, the XOCN is extremely manageable. They're very, very small and compact files. So, and comparing that to other cameras, where perhaps you are kind of forced, if you want to shoot in full frame, to 8K with very big files, whereas you can shoot full frame at 6K with a smaller file. I really do think that Burano will find a place for natural history. And I think the other place really where it's going to fit is observational documentaries. When you're tracking and following people, moving around, it's nice and light. It works really well on your shoulder. So I think those are the areas where it's going to work. Extreme heat won't be a problem. You've got a very good, very large cooling system in the camera with a very big fan that can keep the camera cool to help with that heat. I was out in Dubai and it was almost 40 degrees and we were using Buranos out there without a problem. And I know that it works in the cold. I've done that myself, taken it to very cold environments, and it's not a problem. So I think it will be a good camera for those jobs, especially if you got to fly away somewhere quite remote. So with that, I will wind up the live stream, unless another question comes in the meantime. But just to say, do support your local dealer. My local dealer is Visual Impact, and they've looked after me over the years. Whoever your local dealer is, ring them up and speak to them. Very often you'll find that they can give you a better deal, a better price over the phone than they can on the website, because they can't always show some of the prices they might be able to offer on the website. So do speak to the dealers, build up a relationship with them, because Every now and again, things do go wrong. You might lose something, or you might need a part in a big hurry. And if they know you, if you know them, know who to speak to, they're more inclined to get that part out to you quickly than somebody that's never ever just bought online perhaps. So speak to your dealer, build up that relationship. And of course, Visual Impact, they offer service, rental, sales, events. They can do finance for you, new and used gear. So if you've got stuff you want to trade in, you can talk to them about doing that. Great company to work with. And yes, it really is a live event. There is about a 10-second delay, but it's live. Anyway, I'm going to wrap it up now. Thank you for listening. Thank you for today, for joining in. Thank you for the questions. They're what really make these events. And hopefully we'll do something soon. Cheers for now. Have a good day.